Hello and welcome to Byline Radio. This is What the Papers Don't Say with me, Adrian Goldberg. Today, Russian disinformation and how the West propped up Putin. We'll be joined by Byline Times co-founder and executive editor Peter Jukes and Idrees Ahmad on Russia's information blitz in both Ukraine and Syria, which involves using social media influencers pushing his message. We are truly in the era of the TikTok war. Before we get cracking, just a reminder that Byline Radio comes from the Byline Times and we're funded by ordinary people like you. To support us, please take out a subscription to Byline Times. You'll get a great monthly newspaper. You'll be supporting Byline TV, the Byline Times podcast, where this show is rebroadcast, Byline Radio, and our newsbreaking website, bylinetimes.com, which you may also be listening to this on as well. We'd also welcome your contributions too. If you're listening on the phone, in the bottom left hand of your screen, you should see a little microphone icon. Just tap that to join if you've got a question to ask, or if you want to join in, by all means do so. Latest print edition of Byline Times is out now, and it's got the catch-all title, Russian Disinformation and How the West Propped Up Putin. We'll speak to Peter Jukes, the Byline Times executive editor, about that now. But I'm really intrigued by this idea of the TikTok war. So let's get a word now with Idrees Ahmad. Idrees is a freelance journalist and broadcaster. Idrees, hello. Welcome to Byline Radio. How are you doing? Hello, Idrees.
Yeah, good to join you. Thank you for having me. And I hope you can hear me now.
Yeah, I got you loud and clear now, Idrees. Yeah, go on.
Okay, so that's great. So, yeah, I think one of the things that had been happening for not just right now, but for a few months was as there was more of a crackdown on the various social media platforms and Russian propaganda outlets being labeled, because there were many of them. We recognize Russia Today and Sputnik, but they had set up these various fronts, which initially many people just assumed were just progressive outlets. One of them actually became viral recently. One of some stories they put out just as the invasion started. One of them is quite active, called Soapbox. So, but they started becoming identified and they're labeled by the social media platforms. So the one place which was under the radar was TikTok. So a lot of attention started being paid to TikTok, and a lot of propaganda being started being put out through TikTok, and also it has a younger audience. So it's a way of seeding disinformation, which eventually then percolates up. So that was working rather well, and but there was recently pressure on TikTok, so they have also have had to take measures. But in Russia, recently, what the regime has done is get all these influencers, and it's a very clearly scripted message they have been given, because they're speaking the same words in support of the war. So I think that...
So Idrees, sorry to interrupt you, but just give us a sense then of what happens on TikTok, or how Putin or supporters of the invasion of Ukraine have been trying to influence young people.
Well, it's just the key thing is that you have TikTok. Young people have large audiences, so they've got their own they build their own audiences, and if you can get one of these young people, so you're reaching a few million people. So usually it's very lighthearted material, people doing dances and people speaking about their buying the latest clothes and all of that. So it's mostly an apolitical crowd that turns to TikTok. So as a result, when you are trying to give them a political message, so they're not really equipped to most of them are not really equipped to handle it, because unlike Twitter or on Facebook, where if you post something, somebody can come in and challenge you if you post something that is misleading. On TikTok, that mechanism doesn't really exist. Something can go viral, and then even if you put out a video that is a reply to it, it's not necessarily going to the same people that the first video reached. So because of that, what happens is that you have the potential for reaching a lot of these people who generally, in fact, they take pride in being apolitical, that it's much higher, that they're an available audience. And what the Kremlin tried to do is that through some key influencers, they tried to reach them.
And the evidence for this being a propaganda effort rather than the TikTokers themselves choosing to support the war, you're suggesting, is the fact that the scripts very often sound the same. This isn't young people just spontaneously choosing to support the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, because somebody, I think it was Methuselah or somebody, had actually put those videos side by side. And so when they were speaking the exact words, same words. And so it was very clear that all these TikTokers were speaking off the same script. And I'm hearing some kind of a noise here. I don't know.
Indeed, I can hear that as well, Idrees. I'm not sure if that's where you are. It's not at my end, I have to say. Let's hope it disappears, Idrees. I'll come back to you in a moment, and I'll bring in Peter Jukes, the executive editor of the Byline Times. And Peter, I mentioned that the latest print episode of the Byline Times newspaper is out now, and it's got this title of How the West Propped Up Putin. Idrees is talking about various forms of information or disinformation, both to persuade the Russian public of the worth of the war in Ukraine, but also we know that Putin has used disinformation globally as well. Talk to me, Peter, though, about how the West has been complicit in that information war. Hello, Peter, you there? I think we're having difficulty getting hold of Peter at the moment. I'm not quite sure what's going on. Let's try and bring back Idrees. Idrees, is your line cleared any since the last time we spoke?
Yeah, I'm glad to know that wasn't me. So I'm clear.
Hopefully, I don't think it's me either. It's just one of these things that we get when we're using technology like this. It's just one of those things that happens. So Idrees, you talked about Soapbox. Tell me a little bit more about that then.
Yeah, that was an interesting initiative because it was when it initially emerged. So they were very reluctant to reveal their links to the whole Russian propaganda apparatus. And what happened is that actually a journalist, Charles Davis, did the investigation, and what he found was that there was a parent company called Mafic through which a lot of these fronts were established. And but the positioning was interesting because they positioned themselves as this community-based grassroots initiative, and they would pick up many left-wing causes and do it well. So it was sophisticated and it was done well. And in fact, I had this very interesting conversation with somebody who was a very committed advocate for refugees, has worked with refugees for a long time. And so when the person shared this infographic from Soapbox, so I had this conversation. I asked that, that do you know that this is coming from the Kremlin, and maybe not a good idea to be sharing that at a time when Russia is involved in this major invasion of a neighboring country. So the response was quite interesting because the person said that, well, I have worked with them in when they were in Greece, and they were really, that they seemed like completely sincere and they did really good work. And I had to say that, but do you not see the cynicism here? Because Russia was displacing all these Syrian refugees at the time, and they were being forced from their homes. And then Russian media shows up in Lesbos, gives obviously a completely sympathetic coverage and says that look at how horribly the Europeans are treating these refugees. And, because it works, it aligns very neatly with the story that they are trying to tell. So there was there was this element of sophistication to it that you actually come and pick stories and report on them completely sympathetically and gain an audience with people who do care about these issues. And I think that that's working rather well even now, because there are some real issues, related to refugees, the double standards in the treatment of refugees, or even within refugees, there were issues of racism and, how some refugees were treated better than others. So what they do is they would pick on these aspects and they would then magnify them. And so these issues start defining the whole crisis. So I think that in that respect, it was a rather sophisticated operation. It was targeted very self-consciously at a progressive left-wing audience.
And this opportunism is a key to Russian disinformation as well. You mentioned that in the current conflict, you've got this group called the Azov. You've written about this for the Byline Times. Now, the Azov are a group who are very questionable, to say the least. Amongst their membership, they're a paramilitary group who have been a vital part of the pushback against Russia. But there is a suggestion that a large number of their membership have far-right or neo-Nazi sympathies, and on another occasion, at another time, they may well be worth investigation in their own right. But they have been used by Putin, their existence has been used by Putin to justify his claim that he's seeking to eradicate Ukraine of Nazism.
Yeah, it's so this was very similar to what Putin did when he intervened in Syria, because the ostensible or the kind of cover story was that Putin is intervening in Syria to fight ISIS, except Carter Center and Janes also, they were keeping track of where the bombings were occurring. And it was very clear that for the first almost a year, Russian Air Force barely touched ISIS. In fact, while Russia intervened, ISIS took Palmyra twice. And because the entire focus of the Russian intervention was the anti-Assad rebels, they weren't, in fact, too concerned about ISIS. In fact, ISIS was quite useful to them because they were fighting the anti-Assad rebels. So they were weakening, Assad's enemies. So ISIS was in fact useful to them. So they were not bombing them until they had neutralized the anti-Assad rebels, and then they went on to ISIS. So here, the ostensible kind of story was that they're denazifying and they're coming in because of this Azov. I mean, the thing about Azov, as you say, it's very dubious and nobody should try to sugarcoat it. In fact, even as late as 2019, Time magazine did a pretty good kind of coverage of that. So some of the claims that they have somehow been integrated into the into the Ukrainian army and are no longer a political force, that are not really true. I mean, they remain something that people will have to be concerned about in the future, Ukrainians particularly. So, but the thing is that their numbers are really small. And it's the same as what happened with when they kept on, when Aleppo was being assaulted, they kept on saying that they are there to fight Al-Qaeda, except later on when the UN published this report, out of the 6,000 to 8,000 fighters, 150 were Al-Qaeda. So that's like about, almost like 1%, 1.5 or so percent of the entire force. So same thing is happening over here, that they're inflating the numbers of this small group, and which doesn't define the Ukrainians, and it's a very kind of a small outfit, but it's very useful. It's very convenient for them to focus on this, and that way, they can justify it to themselves and also to their soldiers. They are being told that, most of the soldiers are given very little information, and they're sent off, and they are told that, well, they are there to fight these Nazis, and the Nazis are somehow again at war with Russian speakers, and so it works well as a rationale, but it's just it's another one of those cover stories, because that even if they were fighting Azov, right now they're bombing cities, and so that cover story just falls apart because the actions never match up to the supposed intention which brought them into Ukraine.
Fascinating insight. Idrees, stay with us if you would. That's Idrees Ahmad. You're listening to Byline Radio. My name's Adrian Goldberg. If you want to join in and you're listening live via your Twitter app on the phone, there's a little microphone icon in the bottom left. You might want to have a comment to make or a question to ask. If you do, by all means, as long as it's intelligent and to the point, we'd welcome you on board. And don't forget, we are partnering with the Byline Times. That's where we come from, really. And in case you don't know, that's a monthly newspaper that reports without fear or favour on both UK and global news. No oligarch behind us, no corporate interest. We rely on ordinary people taking out a subscription, but they're £39 a month for a Byline subscription, or maybe even a membership, will not only get you that brilliant monthly newspaper, but you'll also be helping to support Byline Times podcast, which is where Byline Radio is rebroadcast. Byline Radio and Byline TV and our news-breaking website, bylinetimes.com. So your money does go a long way. You can check out bylinetimes.com as well for details on how to subscribe. Let's bring in Peter Jukes. Peter is the co-founder and executive editor of the Byline Times. And Peter, Idrees has been giving us a very good idea of how Russian information and disinformation is working on the ground. But the West, as I mentioned earlier, has been complicit in this for many years. Just talk us through some of the ways in which that has happened and which are exposed in the latest Byline Times print edition.
Yeah, you're complicit in disinformation too, Adrian, because it's £39 a year for Byline Times.
I thought that's what I said, didn't I?
No, you said a month. I think you said a month.
Did I? Oh, right.
And apologies for the poor quality of sound. And I'm actually at there's a helicopter going overhead, a conference, a meeting on disinformation with Bill Browder and various some government officials, all kinds of people, experts in this domain. So, yeah, I mean, the interesting thing has been the way, and Dominic Grieve is also just giving a talk, is the way that we've been supine to this 8-year-long war. You know, when I came back from Kiev a few months after the Maidan, I went there and came back. I was being told by friends, but it's full of neo-Nazis. And as Idrees points out, there were maximum, there's somewhere between 100 and 2,000 Azov battalion in an army and national defense force was like 200,000 or 300,000. At the last elections, the far right got less than 2%. The Wagner Group, big mercenaries for Putin, the founder actually has a swastika on his neck. So yes, our media ecosystem has been weak. I mean, you know the story. I'm sure people know the story of Carol Cadwallader, the legal threats, and still going through a libel trial she has had from Aaron Banks when I helped her and got the emails that documented his many undisclosed meetings with the Russian embassy and leave EU, with the Russian embassy in the run-up to Brexit, to talk about coordinating messaging, talk about golden diamond deals and things like that. That was very difficult to report. Some of that did come out, but generally, most of it got suppressed. I mean, partly it's benign. People think it's a conspiracy theory. Surely Putin doesn't want to invade the West, doesn't really want Ukraine, is rattling his sabers. It's all about positioning. But as, intelligence agencies knew, the US knew, the US Army knew, this was a long campaign in information warfare in preparation and, in real warfare as well, in Ukraine and Syria and Georgia. And I suppose we couldn't believe it. But the other element is that there is an oligarchical tendency in our culture, a love of bling, money, rich Russians bearing gifts. A lot of people are suborned by it, attracted by it. New Labour to Boris Johnson. They're incredibly relaxed with getting on the yachts of a Russian oligarch, and that oligarch funding a football team, funding a museum, funding a university. And they appealed in a targeted way to their own inequalities and corruptions, mainly on the right, mainly on the Conservative Party, but I think also a kind of old Stalinist leaning on the left, or sympathy for anybody who took on US imperialism, and a blindness to Russian imperialism. So money, ideology, compromise, and ego. A lot of people are invested in Putin's not a threat. And I think we all are waking up to a new world. The one thing I say from this conference, which is really interesting, is that everything Idrees has brilliantly documented. Read his piece on Byline Times about Syria and the fake actors and the terrible story of the white helmets, which is just such a tragedy. But when it came to Mariupol, the bombing of the maternity hospital, Russia, came up and all their agents for this. Oh, they're all actors, fake actors, but it didn't work. Why? Because of information against disinformation, information from people like Idrees, like Bellingcat, who exposed these lies in the past. And to the credit of the US and UK government, them giving up all the intelligence for 2 months, saying, no, look, they're going to invade, go and invade. Unlike Iraq, where they believe their own Saddam's misinformation, their own misinformation. Here, they've come much more clean of the sources and got ahead of the game. And I think that's my conclusion of this. You don't fight disinformation with more disinformation. You fight it with the truth.
One thing that you identify, Idrees, as a change between the Ukraine war and the Syrian war is the ability to use open source data to demonstrate that some of this disinformation is false. Click on your microphone there, Idrees, to talk to us.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I think that was kind of the Syrian war could not have been reported any other way, because at the very beginning, the regime sent this very clear message when they killed Marie Colvin that you will not be welcome here unless you come on a regime visa and are accompanied by regime minders. So over the years, the visa was restricted to some friendly journalists, and most people just couldn't visit. And the people who did visit and wrote critically, they never got the visa again. So because of that, what happened is that many of the sieges and many of these things that were happening in places which were inaccessible to journalists could only be seen, or reports could only be could only come out of there through whatever people were recording on their cell phones and what they were witnessing. And but that also obviously creates this room for disinformation. So it became critical that there was somebody outside who was parsing through this information, verifying the location, timing, and everything, and confirming that this incident did happen at the location it's claimed to have happened, and then also finding multiple angles into the same incident and multiple ways to confirm what has happened and to corroborate. And I think that that's where credit to Elliot Higgins, who pioneered many of the techniques, and Bellingcat did extraordinary work all the way back from. In fact, that's how I had first met Peter and Elliot together at a Google's Ideas thing back in 2013, and so. It was really essential at this time when there was no other way of corroborating incidents that were occurring, and especially when the chemical attack happened. So over the years, the open source methods became mature, and they were more and more people started getting involved, and Bellingcat itself became this kind of a magnet for attracting all this talent of all these people who had this kind of surplus energy, and which they were willing to put into this can be very laborious work, and they were able to put that into it, and they brought a kind of precision to reporting which was absent. And the biggest clash of that happened when the celebrated journalists like Seymour Hersh went in and they wrote stories which turned out to be absolute nonsense, and they were just fed information by their dubious sources. And whereas here, verifiably being shown that what has occurred and where the missiles came from, which bombed these two neighborhoods in which the chemical attack had happened. So I think that the biggest, the thing that distinguished this type of journalism, the open source method, was its transparency. That if you have doubts, okay, go and here are the coordinates, here's the map, and go and try to look for yourself. And so everybody could see that, well, here is the information confirming a claim, or also because in this case, eyewitness testimonies. Because one of the struggles in many of these conflicts is one of the AP journalists recently said that, who made out of Mariupol, that one of the aims that Ukrainians put their lives at risk to get these journalists out. They said to them that, well, it's important for you to go out and tell the story, because if we are witnessing things and we can speak about it, but that gets dismissed. And it is, unfortunately, the truth. Same thing had happened in Syria when Paul Conroy got injured. That I think it was 18 activists died in his evacuation because they thought it was that important for this person to go out and tell that story. It so much depended on the journalists and their ability to witness. And I think that was one of the big challenges that open source journalism has been, in many respects, able to overcome. So I think that knowledge has been immensely important in this conflict, because it did two things. One is obviously it put the perpetrators on notice that whatever they do, it will be witnessed by somebody, and it will be then tied to them. The second thing it did is also it made the national intelligence agencies more agile, that they have to now cut through their unnecessary red tape and classification systems, which used to withhold their information or sources for so long that it would become irrelevant, because by that time, the other side would have seeded disinformation to such a level that, even if you speak the truth later on, it is just one more claim among so many others. So in this instance, even the U.S. intelligence was ahead of the game. It was giving warnings ahead of the game. And in many ways, it may have even thwarted many of the things that it warned about, that some of the actions that the Kremlin was considering, and then they didn't follow through.
And Idrees, you mentioned this example from Syria. This was kind of pre-Bellingcat, pre the age of people being able to use open source data to verify facts. And this story, which did the rounds, that there was a girl who was being used as an actor, who was the supposed victim in a number of these atrocities. And it was used by Russia and supporters of Russia to spin this narrative that some of the awful events in Syria were being staged for the cameras. And the evidence for that was the presence of this girl actor in a number of these tragedies. Now, eventually, this lie was debunked, but not before it had managed to get huge traction around the world.
Yes, I think it's we saw many instances of that happening. It started much earlier, but probably some of the most prominent instances were when Aleppo was under siege and it was being annihilated. So there was a young girl who started tweeting about help by her parents. So she started tweeting about this whole incident, and so immediately all these stories went around that this is a crisis actor. She's probably not even in Aleppo, and this whole thing is staged. And at that time, one of Bellingcat's investigations was immensely important. Nick Waters did this investigation where, and here also there's a question of journalistic ethics, because I think to me this was a very critical incident. So many of us actually, well, I won't say many, but some of us actually knew, because we were in touch with this girl's mother, that, and we knew that, well, people are real and they are there and all of that. We knew that, but the information couldn't be revealed because the regime was actively trying to target. So Nick Waters did this whole investigation where he geolocated through images exactly where this girl is tweeting from, the images she had posted, which apartment block she lives in, which floor even from which she's taking the photographs. But they held on to this information, because if they publish it, I mean, it's a nice scoop, but if you publish it, you're putting this girl's life in danger. So meanwhile, the New York Times did a pretty irresponsible thing, that they actually did a story which promoted, in fact, the claim that this girl may not be real, and that this is some kind of PR initiative. It was a highly irresponsible story, but Bellingcat held on to the information until the girl was safely out after the whole evacuation deal, and that's when it was finally published, confirming that this is where the girl was, this is how she accessed the internet and all of that. So they kept on doing the stories saying that, well, a lot of these rescue videos that they are staged, and one of the claims that they made in this very clever kind of spectacle they organized at the UN offices in New York was they brought in this Canadian woman, and she claimed that she was.
Idrees, sorry, your line isn't brilliant. I don't know if you can just move somewhere where you've got slightly better reception. We're kind of getting your message, but it is a little bit in and out, I'm afraid. But I think we certainly get the gist from this. I'm going to bring in Darren in just a moment. But Peter, Idrees touches on something there, which is the credulity of certain Western media outlets. It can be difficult, though, can't it, when you're presented with information which appears on the face of it to be true, and you want to seem to be perhaps not siding with one side or another in a conflict. There can be this fog of war, for want of a better phrase. Oh, and now Peter's gone. Let's bring in Darren. Hello, Darren. How are you doing?
Hello.
Yeah, hi, Darren. Go on. You're on Byline Radio. What do you want to say?
How we doing? I was going to say that the misinformation is absolutely disgusting, really, that it's been going on for so long. And it seems to be absolutely everywhere. So really the question I want to ask is, like, what can be done? What should be done? Because it seems as if, most European countries, the Russians have really done a number on us here. Most European countries seem to be infiltrated to a point that it's not just guys taking backhanders. They must know what they were doing. So what should be done? What can be done? Because there's no way this can continue down the line. There needs to be a major, major shake-up here, or we're all in serious trouble if we're not beyond the point at the minute, It's pretty scary, to be honest, like, when you look at what's happening. But, and the other point I was going to say is, that's in the long term, really. In the short term, what could be done to get the truth out to Russians? If they have got stuff blocked left, right, and center, what I was thinking is to get anybody who has contacts, to try and get VPNs, companies giving out free VPN for Russia, so that they can bypass stuff to see, independent media to try and get the truth, as opposed to the Russian propaganda that they're being fed at the minute. That's maybe something in the short term that could be done, but it's just a mess, really.
Darren, stay there. Let me ask Idrees about that then. So Idrees, Darren, I think, makes two very good points and asks two very pertinent questions. One is, how can we help people in Russia get the truth? Would there be an argument for companies who issue VPNs somehow distributing them in Russia? But what can we in the West do as well to make sure that we are more on guard in future for this kind of mass disinformation?
Well, I think one of the vulnerabilities which still hasn't been addressed is that how the divisions within Western society, they get exploited for. Russia has been doing that noticeably since 2015, and did it during key moments here, during the Brexit vote in the US, during the Trump vote, and it's even now you can see that with broadcasts by people like Tucker Carlson, because the Russian message is very important in finding the cleavages within the society and trying to exploit by giving one side some kind of an argument that they can beat the other side with. And probably, the Carlson incident in the US is a good example. And they also find people they are not necessarily ideologically, they tend to be more opportunistic, so they can find allies on the left, on the right. And so I think that for that reason, one of the recognitions has to be that there needs to be some kind of a consensus view within the West has to be developed, which accepts that, well, there are some things on which, for partisan advantage, you're not going to compromise, and that's easier said than done. I mean, because I don't think that Tucker Carlson's huge ratings and his favorability among people like on the right, that anybody's going to cede that because it's so useful to them for attacking the opposition. So I think we have that vulnerability, and we have to recognize that within our societies that will remain. It's not just new. The Soviets also exploited many of these, and many of them were legitimate issues, like when it was a question of racial inequality. So you don't need to be a propaganda genius to come in and simply highlight the cases of police brutality in the U.S. And suddenly you have already given a whole lot of people reason to be very angry with the system. So I think that one is probably that was one of the there were not many advantages to the Cold War, but because of this type of contestation, societies at least had to be more conscious about how they presented themselves to the rest of the world. And so I think those vulnerabilities. So that's more of a long-term project. But in terms of right now, how do you address this onslaught of propaganda? I think some of the things are being done which should have been done a long time ago, like labeling of these accounts which are clearly state-backed, but that still leaves us with the vulnerability of the people who are free agents, who kind of, as I was mentioning in the article, that propaganda tends to be parasitic, and there are many willing hosts who carry the message forward. And those are the people we have to be more conscious of and aware of, because they are within our own societies. And some of them are not. I don't think that, somebody like Glenn Greenwald has to be paid. I don't think anybody pays him. That's his politics, and he's not bothered by the fact that he's advancing a hostile foreign states agenda. So that problem exists, but the labeling and the identification of many of the overt agents, that has been useful. The second thing is probably one of the most effective things that recently happened was that Arnold Schwarzenegger message, because he has a huge following in Russia, including, I think he's one of the few people that on Twitter the president's account follows. And so it's really went around on VKontakte and other places, and so people were sharing that video over Telegram. And so that was a very effective propaganda. Well, it's messaging, but yeah, it is propaganda, and it was very useful because it was reaching the right audience, and here is a person who did have this huge audience. So I think we also need to have people with credibility and who have something worthwhile to say. I'm not even sure that anybody prompted Arnold Schwarzenegger to issue that message. It's so, in fact, out of line with his own party right now. And but I think that what he did was really a very important action and unbidden, and he did something really extraordinary, and it was such a good message. It was a really well-crafted message, and so that kind of messages reaches people. But yeah, I think one of the suggestions that Darren made, it's hard to say whether that's going to be effective or not, because sometimes people do not want to be told by others that somehow you are uninformed, that let me, a Westerner explain to you what's happening to you, unless you have credibility with them, that they have some reason to trust you. Because otherwise, it's easy enough. Anybody can join VKontakte, and then you can go there and post messages which is revealing the kind of facts that are being suppressed currently on Russian media. The only problem with that sometimes is that there's a potential for backlash. In 2004, when Bush was running for re-election, so I think Guardian had done this thing that they got their readers to write a letter to an American in the US, explaining to them why they shouldn't vote for Bush. And that had a big backlash, because many people just didn't want to hear, why should a Brit be telling me who I should vote for or not. So I think that that's something that you have to do with it a bit more caution.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point, and it's a very good example as well of how people don't like to be told that they are wrong, and in a sense, telling that they're wrong if it comes from the wrong source can reinforce their sense that they are right. I want to bring in Peter Jukes again, and Peter. Idrees was talking about this idea of trying to build a consensus in the West so that we're not so vulnerable to disinformation. But here in the UK, we have a situation where one of the key divisions in society is Brexit, and the EU referendum is long gone. The EU referendum was in 2016, so 6 years ago, yet we still have senior politicians. I'm thinking of the Chancellor in yesterday's spring statement, his mini budget, pressing on those levers, pressing on those sore points to gain political advantage, even though we can now see that whatever your belief about Leave or Remain, the Brexit vote was something which gave succour to Putin and to Russia.
Yeah, I call it the Great Brexit Compromat because there was definitely, and just this meeting talking about it today, Russian influence interference in the referendum, whether it made a difference or not with a close vote, because the security services were not tasked to investigate, and they do not, unlike the theories of the deep state, try to act outside the ambit of a democratic government. It never was. And therefore, that meant that even though a lot of these, and a conservative politician, very contra Putin, if you like, very aware of Russian influence operations, told me in 2017, when I attended an all-parliamentary group in the House of Commons, which had been set up by Chris Bryant, Labour MP, he told me, yes, Russia's trying to influence things, don't make it about Brexit. In 2018, Tom Watson was at the Byline Festival and said, this is now 4 years ago, there should be an inquiry into Russian influence in our elections. Ignored by the Labour Party, wasn't in favour with the current leader then, and of course ignored by the Conservative Party. So we have this thing that Brexit was so precious, so important to the political careers, particularly of people like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and Dominic Cummings, that everything should be ignored for that. Now, that is history. I, by the way, did not want an investigation into Russian interference and money, potentially, and definitely online operations, because I wanted to overturn the vote. I'd accepted the Brexit vote come to 2016. It was only 2017 when Robert Mueller comes to London for his first indictment against the Trump aide, who's in London meeting a professor also in London, who I had an email from, who was going to talk, who was supposed to be a Russian agent, and he was about to meet Boris Johnson to talk about Brexit. It became clear to me, and is now very clear from analyses both from Russian information sources, US Army analysis, that Brexit was a huge win for him. It destabilized the EU, which was his key enemy after Ukraine and the Maidan. You remember those people in the Maidan, the 100 who died, wanted to join the EU, not some Eurasian Union. But that is all in the past. Let's be clear, whatever the rights and wrongs of Brexit, and people who may starve, they may be hungrier, they may be disaffected, it's not resulting in thousands of casualties every day. I'm not going to relitigate the EU referendum. I think it's a mistake, but I accept that has now happened, and we won't go back. Well, even if we want to, will they have us back? But this is bigger. It's much bigger than that. And let's drop whether it's won the election. Just accept that there was a Putin operation on that. There was a Putin occupation of our upper aristocratic classes through oligarchy. And because now it's life or death. Now it's, I hate this exaggeration of World War III. I don't think there's much threat of a nuclear strike, but Putin has made it clear. His spokesman people have made it clear. He's in a war against the West. And what is the threat from Ukraine? Ukraine's never going to invade Russia. Ukraine poses no threat to Russia. What it poses an existential example of how to avoid kleptocracy, of a different way, a more democratic way, an anti-corrupt way. And he cannot abide that because that threatens his model. And I think, I don't care if you're Brexiteer, Remainer, somewhere in between. We're now in a fight for, or other people are shedding their blood, but we are in a fight for liberal democracy, not liberal as in Lib Dem, or liberal, the rules we've abided by for 100 years, maybe 200 of human rights, of free and fair elections, maybe that's only 100-year-old. This engages us all. So they may still play the Brexit game, and they are still. Boris Johnson famously said, the people of Ukraine, a bit like Brexit. And he had to, and the former president of Ukraine criticized him for this, because those people died in the Maidan to be part of the EU. Don't politicize it in an old battle. That's gone. The stakes are now much higher.
But I suppose my point, Peter, is, and drawing on from what Idrees said, is that certainly at the top of the government, there is an unwillingness to kind of say, OK, things have moved on. We are now in a different situation. We are not refighting the battle of Brexit. As you say, Brexit is over and done with in terms of the referendum, but in terms of investigating what happened and in terms of accepting that there was an attempt, however successful or otherwise, by the Russians to meddle with our democracy, that information, that insight still hasn't been taken on at the top of our political establishments.
Yes, and in that way, having been all sort of let's all join Kumbaya together and on the same side against Putin, they let us down for 8 years, let the Ukrainians down, and us down for 4. They allowed the Trojan horse of money to come in over 20 years, but more than anything, turned a blind eye. And as I said, partly ideological alignment with Putin, because he funds a lot of these groups and his oligarchs, very right-wing, anti-abortion, anti-women's rights. There is an alignment, more obvious in the United States, where the Republican Party has more in common with Putin than they do with Joe Biden. This has to be fought at every level. And yeah, I agree. There needs to be, as Tom Watson asked for 4 years ago, deputy leader of the Labour Party, completely ignored, an inquiry. But the press wouldn't cover it because the press, as we know, most of the non-dom owners were for Brexit for whatever reason. And even the ones which were for Remain, like the Lebedevs, the Evening Standard, the Independent, were actually for, supporting the annexation of Crimea. Oh, maybe as Lebedev, Alexander Lebedev, the son of the owner of the Independent Standard, tweeted out, maybe Litvinenko wasn't poisoned by Russian polonium. Maybe it's something else. We cannot go on with those kind of lies in our midst, because these aren't lies like, I'm 6'6" tall or I'm worth this amount of money. These are lies about death, about why people have died and why they're going to die. It's more than propaganda. It's lethal misinformation. Because if you tell people, they're all Nazis.
Sorry, Peter. You mean Evgeny Lebedev, the son of Alexander Lebedev. Let's bring in. Let's bring in original Griffin. I'm conscious both you and Idrees will have very important things to do, so we'll end this in about 10 minutes' time. But I'm keen to get as many voices as possible as I can on air before then. Original Griffin, hello, welcome to Byline Radio.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear. Go on.
Okay, great. Yeah, this is a topic that, there's two parts to my comment. But firstly, I'm obviously British, but I've lived in New York for 20 years. I work as a media consultant. My husband was a journalist, and in fact, he wrote a big feature about Russian oligarchs in about 2007 for Vanity Fair. Now, he got paid for this story 3 times over by the London and the Italian editions, and it never ran. And it wasn't until about 2 years later that we found out, actually through the office of Vanity Fair in London, that as soon as they started fact-checking for the story, they had put the heavies on the entire Condé Nast operation, threatening to pull out all of their advertising from the Russia edition, to declare Condé Nast an enemy of the foreign state. And at that time, Condé Nast was really pushing into all of its foreign editions, and that was an important market for it. So instead, they just killed the piece and it never ran. And that kind of soft kind of acquiescence is exactly the kind of stuff that got us to where we are. Permitting Russia to commit all these malignancies against our values, particularly in the press and the media, is a real problem. And it started long before the disinformation. So as soon as 2016 rolled around, I was on high alert. And I think for the lone voices like yourselves that have really been trying to kind of call the whistle, and they've done an excellent job about making it. There's a real difference between misinformation and propaganda, and we're so conditioned to understand what propaganda is, and that it's a positive message against them, from a malignant force to try and make you think better of them. Disinformation is very, very, very different, and it's intended to confuse you. So anything is fair game with disinformation. The moment anything comes up, any matter, they will seize on that and push it every different way till Sunday so that nothing feels true. Anyway, that was all I wanted to say. Thank you.
That's very. Oh, hello! Is the dog joining in now? I don't know whose dog that is. It's not mine. Just
mine,
to say,
sorry.
by the way. Oh, it's okay. What's the dog's name?
Funnily enough, the dog's name is Oleg. He came from Russia.
Okay. Well, maybe he's got a point of disinformation to make. I don't know.
He did come microchipped, so we've always wondered.
He's been paid by Putin. You wait and see. Original Griffin, thank you very much indeed. And of course, if anybody from Condé Nast is listening, or either live on Byline Radio or hears this via the Byline Times podcast and wants to put their side of that story, we would love to hear from you. More than happy, always, to hear the other side of a story. Obviously, that call has come on. We can't control what they say. But if Condé Nast do wish to challenge it, by all means, please come on and tell us here at Byline Radio. Idrees, I'm just going to give a final thought to you in terms of where we go from here, because I've mentioned to Peter that the British establishment does not appear willing to take on these insights. But at Byline Times, we've been reporting about misinformation, disinformation for a number of years. You've come on board with your terrific article. How do we make sure that this understanding of what's going on in the world is more widely understood?
Well, I think we have to probably take a lesson from the states, which are very much the frontline states. Ukraine was one of them. The Baltic states are there, and then Finland, because they've taken the threat of disinformation as an existential one, and they have taken measures going all the way to education in schools, and they've been quite effective. And so there are organizations in Ukraine like Stop Fake, and there are similar initiatives in across the Baltic countries, and because they have been exposed to this for far longer, beginning in the early 90s. And so I think that there's a lot of things that we can learn from them. And one of the points your last speaker raised was a very important one, because propaganda usually has two functions. One is the positive function of persuasion, and the second one is the negative function of obfuscation. Because propaganda ultimately is about action, either getting you to do something or getting you to or stopping you from doing something. So in the case of action, they persuade you. In the case of inaction, when your inaction is required. So then obfuscation, they create doubt, and that's where all this seeding of obviously sometimes fake stories is important, because it's a way of making truth become indistinguishable from all these false claims. So I think that if we create that kind of resilience, and we also create this kind of a way for individuals to just understand that what kind of their kind of cognitive vulnerabilities which are being exploited, or their political kind of sensitivities which are being exploited. So there will be a greater sensitivity, that people will be more conscious of propaganda without becoming paranoid, because we have one of the biggest distinctions we have lost, and that's why we have so much conspiracism. Conspiracism always take the fount of, well, I'm a critical thinker, every conspiracy theorist says. But the thing is that they have lost the distinction between cynicism and skepticism. We need skepticism, and we need to be able to distinguish it from cynicism.
But building resilience of citizens through education, through school, that's a really interesting takeaway point. I'm going to give a final word to Goa Cricket. Hello, Goa Cricket. Welcome to Byline Radio. What's your comment?
I just want to talk about lying, really, and the fact that it's sort of habit forming and more of a culture. So if you thought about the pressure put on our politicians, not naming any, it puts them, it's sort of increasing, is that you start with little ones and then it becomes habit forming, then you get bigger ones. And ultimately it's just to undermine the poor sucker that's got roped into it. The problem we have, if Boris starts lying like it's a habit, then everyone's got to follow him. All his top civil servants have got to follow him. We're seeing it now. And that's what causes the damage. And that is why, ultimately, those around him are not really interested about digging it up, because half of them have had to chip in anyway.
The very idea that Boris Johnson would be a liar, I find frankly astonishing. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, it's more the effects of his lying that is more of the issue. His stupid lying is not the issue.
I take your point about the corrosive influence of lying, and I think it's a fair one as well. Thank you for joining in. This has been Byline Radio. Thank you to everybody who's taken part. Thank you very much indeed for Idrees Ahmad. Really good to speak to you, Idrees. Thank you. Thank you to Byline Times executive editor and co-founder Peter Jukes. Thanks to all of you who've taken time as well to make a comment. If you're listening to this live on Byline Radio, or if you're listening to this back on Catch Up via Byline Times podcast, please don't forget that our work is all supported by subscriptions and memberships to the Byline Times, which, as Peter Jukes correctly pointed out, does not cost £39 a month. It costs £39 a year, which is rather less. So if you can afford it, even in these very cash-strapped times, please do so. It keeps us all in a job and allows us to broadcast without fear or without favour. We'll be back again at noon tomorrow. Thanks, everybody, for joining in. We'll see you then.